Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of SSH Writers on Writing, where we talk to academics across the disciplines and ask them about their process or their lack of process when they're working. And we ask them what they expect from their students and whether they prefer the Beatles to the Rolling Stones. I am Lori Enns, the SSH Writing Center Coordinator at Nazarbayev University. And if there's students who want to know more about writing in the disciplines, or just any writing tips, please visit our website, which will be in the show notes. Now, as we know, writing across the disciplines is varied and it can be significantly different depending on what subject you're writing in. And a goal of this podcast show is to discover, to unpack and demystify those differences, and also to shed light on the great writers that we have at NU. And speaking of that, today, our guest on this show is Associate Professor of Literature, James Nikopoulos, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him. His research focuses on international modernisms with a particular emphasis paid to affect and classical reception. Much of this work centers on laughter, on its relationship with joy, and how literary texts invoke its name to depict social interaction and incite emotional experience. His latest book is called Introduction to the Stability of Laughter, The Problem of Joy in Modernist Literature. James Nikopoulos, welcome to our show.
Nice to be here. It's a pleasure.
Great. So I was going to ask, first of all, as I was reading the title of your latest book, and The Problem of Joy in Modernist Literature felt a little bit to me like a strange title, because you're associating laughter with joy. Laughter with a problem, joy with a problem. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a couple things about it, right? Like in like normal human world, i.e. outside of my field and everything. Like if you say laughter is always about being joyous, it's like, oh yeah, well, obvious. And then someone will chime in and go, well, not necessarily, because we laugh at people all the time and we humiliate them and mock them, right? And so they see it as having like this dark side, and so there's a kind of contradiction there. And so to associate it with joy is kind of problematic to those people, at first at least. And then in my field as well, like when you look at literature in the early 20th century, which is what this book is about, it is like we've always spoken about this time period as a time period of crisis. For kind of obvious reasons, right? Just to name a few fun events from those years: World War I, the Spanish influenza, World War II, the Great Depression, right? Like the Holocaust, all these horrible things have happened, and literature was always reacting to its times, right? And so part of what the book is about how people have conceptualized these times as kind of really depressing. Like the great modern writer of this time would be someone like Kafka, right? And everyone but then they say he's funny. And I'm like, kind of. But so when you talk about joy in the early 20th century, it sounds a bit like it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So that's why I refer to it as a kind of problem.
Okay. All right. So that sounds really interesting. So is there something in particular, as you were going through your university years, is there something that made you decide to do a PhD in literature? What pushed you in that direction? Is there anything particular?
Well, in my undergraduate years, I was completely unsure of how my future would turn out. I was only really sure of one thing, and I'm not joking here. The only thing I was completely sure of is that I would never, ever go back to school. I was so done I'm completely serious. By the beginning of my senior year, I was done with school. I thought, I'm not getting anything more from this. And 2 years later, I changed my mind.
Wow.
So it's like I tell my students all the time, like I use this as an example for why some people will know what they're going to do and they kind of stick along that path, right? But for a lot of people, things change dramatically in very short periods of time, especially in these years in your early 20s. And so don't be surprised when these things happen. Mm-hmm.
So speaking of surprises, did you have, as Did you have embarrassing moments? Can you think of your most embarrassing moment that you had going through your young adult years?
Oh my goodness. Oh, where to begin? I mean, the thing is like I was debilitatingly shy up until college. So when you're debilitatingly shy, you do everything right to avoid getting in situations in which you'll have mortifying, embarrassing moments, right? Like in Spanish class in high school once, she asked me a question, our teacher, and my voice cracked. It was like a Brady Bunch episode or something, like the kind of stuff that every adolescent boy fears. There was those kinds of things. But and then in college, I was in lots of big lectures and big classes, and I didn't really speak up, so I couldn't have really had many embarrassing moments. I was too afraid to be embarrassed, actually. I mean, my big regret is of being too afraid to be embarrassed. And if I had had more embarrassing moments, I probably would have enjoyed more when I was younger and definitely learned more.
Oh, so that sounds to me like, the nurse in Australia who wrote the book about what do you regret on your deathbed? And she says most people said that they regretted not being bold enough or something like that, not challenging themselves enough. So
I think it's become a cliche now, right? That unless you're a horrible person and you've committed something criminal or something, your major regrets aren't things you did, but things that you didn't do, right?
Things that you didn't
and
do.
so I fall into that cliche, and yeah.
Okay. So let's switch a little bit into writing. So when you were doing your PhD, or let's say as you were moving towards your graduate work in writing, did you find that the structures within the writing that you were being asked to write in, was that intuitive to you, the whole structure of your writing in your discipline?
Absolutely not. It's still not. I've been figuring it out all this time. I'm much more of a creative writer. I wanted to write kind of more creative things. And I went into a PhD in literature because obviously I love stories. And so I'm much more, I think in the sense of narrative, in the sense of telling a story. And when you tell a story, you don't like tell the whole story in the beginning, right? And then explain it as you move forward, because that kills the story, right? You kind of want to leave a little suspense, which is the opposite of what you do in good expository writing, right? Because a thesis basically kind of gives away the ending for the most part at the beginning, and then you go step by step. And I've always known this, and I was able to do this to an extent in order, otherwise I wouldn't have graduated. But I always hated it and thought, this is why so much expository writing is so boring. And I wanted to kind of let a story kind of unfold through the argument. I've switched now. I think I was a bit immature and naive at the time, because that presupposes that someone is going to sit down with one of your essays the way they would sit down with a Faulkner novel, but people don't do that. They want to get to the point and see if they won't be wasting their time. And it makes perfect sense because people don't have that much time and they want to know if this is worth reading or not. And so I've switched, and I realized actually an argument that is really insightful can be just as exciting as a story.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes. I think one of the big things you have to learn when you switch from creative to nonfiction writing, you see this even with the great creative writers, like novelists, for example, who write nonfiction. There's still storytelling in the nonfiction, right? In the essay, there's still a bit of suspense and there's a character and we don't know exactly where we're going to go. But for the most part, it's not the story and the characterization that's doing most of the work, right? It's the ideas. It has, I think. I mean, there are some exceptions, right? There are memoirs and more creative forms of nonfiction. But in terms of more argumentative nonfiction, it's the brilliance of the argument and the insights in the argument that are doing all the work, and you have to let it do the work.
Okay, so that sounds like the arguments are actually taking on a character. What do you call it? The reifying, so the arguments are becoming a character in the story. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, in a sense, yes. I would say, yeah. It's kind of imagine reading Darwin or something, right? Like, I mean, Darwin as a person is an extremely interesting character, right? And his travels on the Beagle. I mean, this is like an adventure story to end all adventure stories, right? But in the end, the excitement of the idea of natural selection is what grabs you, okay? And the characters are there for the ride. Let's put it this way: the characters are there in service of the argument, whereas what you would get in stories is you'll get like characters in service of the plot, or a plot in service of the characterization, right? So it ends up being a bit switched.
Right. Wow. Okay, so now that being said, let's move into a little bit about what you expect then from your students. And so you've been reading papers for years now. You've been reading undergraduate papers and graduate papers. Is there something that comes up again and again that you find frustrating about student writing? I'm guessing there's a number of things, but like just give us, 1, 2, or 3, for example.
My students will be sick of me hearing me say this, but generalizations drive me insane. Keep in mind though, I mean, I'm writing from the discipline of literature, right? So the point, the cliche is, right, that like more scientific fields will take something very complicated and try and simplify a portion of it to make sense of it. Whereas what you get in the humanities more often is you get things, phenomena in life among people that seem pretty straightforward and that you understand, but you realizing there's much more under the surface that you haven't really looked at. So what you end up doing with literature and intellectual history is the opposite of what you would do in scientific inquiry usually, which is complicate things, right? To show how things are much messier than they really are, or than they seem, sorry. And what drives me crazy with students is they'll give you something like, they'll quote a line from a book, and instead of going through all the things that are happening in this moment in the story, like all the complications in the language, they'll say something, in this scene, the author, demonstrates, the emotional impact of the character, or, this shines a light on the emphasis of the character's emotions, or something like this, which is just, it's horrendously generic, right? And my rule of thumb that I tell students over and over, and I think it's a good rule of thumb in writing, is that if you can take any sentence in your essay and put it almost verbatim in a different essay on a different subject, then you're being too generic. Right? Like when you say that this like brings to life like the drama of the characters, right? Which I get generic statements like this all the time. You can say this about War and Peace. You can say this about the Odyssey. You can say this about the Ramayana. I mean, you know what I mean? You can say this about Darwin's adventures on the Beagle. So in a sense, if you're saying something that generic, you're not really saying anything.
Okay, that's good advice. Don't be too generic. Okay, so that's a good way to describe it. So can we ask you a little bit about your rituals? So
sure.
So we know that different writers have different rituals, and some of them are pretty weird. Like Agatha Christie wrote in the bathtub, and was it James Joyce who wrote on his stomach he had to use a blue pencil. Do you have any rituals that you follow when you're getting to work?
Well, keep in mind with James Joyce, he was going blind, and I'm pretty sure when he started working, he was hungover because he worked in the mornings and he got drunk pretty much every evening. So that might be
good to know.
Yeah. When I was young, like an undergrad, I felt like if I wanted to do like serious writing, I had to be like in this place, right? And this place was always at night because daytime wasn't mysterious enough. So it'd be late at night, completely alone, no distractions. I'd have to have some kind of really atmospheric, brooding music playing at the time, and that was the only way I could seriously write. And that is absolute nonsense. And the sooner people get disabused of this idea that there's like you just suddenly turn on a light bulb, right? Light bulbs turn on because you've been wiring the electricity for years, right? So it really is just the habit of getting in and doing things on a regular basis and thinking deeply about things over time. As I got older and had a family and had less and less time, if I had kept to my rituals and said I can only write, like I went to grad school, for example, with people who would say things like, I can't work on my dissertation this semester because I teach this day, and this day, and I need at least 3 days in a row of no teaching to get into a groove. And like, imagine anyone working in any other job doing this.
It doesn't sound productive.
They would be like, what is wrong with you? You late? I mean, like in the real world, that doesn't work. If you're Agatha Christie and you're selling almost as many books as the Bible, then you can, or if you're James Joyce and you're ignoring taking care of your family, then you can set yourself up with any ritual you want. But when you realize, okay, if I'm going to write anything on a regular basis, it might mean I only write an hour here, a couple hours there. It actually, people have said to me, like, how do you get anything done after you had kids, for example, if you have small children?
Right.
And I actually said, you're more productive because you realize I only have those 2 hours. I'm really going to work. I'm not going to mess around.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think you need to understand is your brain is just like any other part of your body. If it's not fed or not well rested, it's not going to work well. And so I don't believe in sitting there if you're absolutely exhausted and your mind isn't working, and just forcing yourself to write whatever crap. Because like, I think anyone who's ever done that knows you do that and you put something down and then the next day you have to erase it all anyway.
Right.
So the ritual is try and do it when you're rested, these kinds of things.
So that sounds, usually we associate writers with bad habits, right? Like cigar smoking, heavy drinkers, nighttime workers. But it sounds like what you're saying is you have to have a brain that's healthy, which means looking after yourself physically.
Yeah, you have to. Let's put it this way. I haven't read that many biographies of alcoholic writers, but I've read, Hemingway's and Fitzgerald's and Joyce's and so all these alcoholic writers, and everyone thinks that the alcoholism like kind of helps fuel their creativity, which I actually never bought. You'll find they're working in the mornings because they're getting drunk all evening, so they really don't have any other choice. So yeah, you have to take care of yourself to an extent. I like to go. People see me all the time working in random places. Like they'll see me working at the Starbucks, like in the middle of the atrium, in the balcony, like anywhere but my office. Anywhere where I think people will leave me alone helps. Yeah. And I find changing, I'm actually like against ritual in this sense, in that like I'll get into a ritual and like this is the place for me to work. And then a month later, it kind of feels boring. And I find that changing environment stimulates me and it makes it a bit better. So like if you're having trouble, if you're the kind of person that needs stimulation, then oftentimes just working in a new place helps.
Just find a different place to work. That sounds like a good advice. We've come to the part of the show where I'm going to give you a set of either ors. And then you're just going to tell us what you prefer. Ready? Okay. Sure. Here we go. Beatles or the Rolling Stones?
Radiohead.
What? You got it. Okay, we'll let you go with that one. Okay.
My students will expect this from me.
Country or city?
It's always been city, but now I'm becoming more country, so I don't know.
Okay, all right.
City
good.
For now.
Okay, all right. It's a toss-up. Morning or evening?
That's another one. It was always evening when I was younger. Now I would say morning.
Okay. Comedy or horror?
Comedy.
Okay, all right. I guess you'd have to say that, right?
If you said comedy or tragedy, it would be a toss-up for me. But horror is like,
oh, it's just not
doesn't do it
part
for
of
me.
it. Okay. And fiction or nonfiction?
Fiction.
Okay. You've heard it. You've all heard it from Professor James Nikopoulos. Thank you so much for all of your advice. Thank you for agreeing to be on the show. And good luck with your next book. We'll see you later.
Thank you. See you soon. Take care, everybody.